I'm Marjorie Taylor. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Oregon, and I've been studying children's imaginary companions for decades. It's a phenomenon that has held my attention for so long because I find it so fascinating that children, very young children, even as young as 2 sometimes, can have the capacity to create a friend that they can derive real comfort and support from, that they love. So when I started doing this work, there wasn't a lot on the topic, primarily I think because people assumed that it was relatively rare that children had imaginary friends, and that maybe it was a red flag of some sort, that this is a shy child who has trouble making real friends and really wouldn't want to communicate what they were doing to an adult. All that's so wrong. It's so wrong. Many children have imaginary friends. We found that if you follow children up to about the age of 7, you find that as many as 65% have had some experience along the way with an imaginary friend. If you don't want to include stuffed animals, like, Calvin and Hobbes, some children have a stuffed animal that becomes a very special friend. But if you don't want to include those, you just want to talk about the invisible imaginary friends, then about 37-38% of children up to the age of 7 have had some experience. So that's a lot of children who do this. This is a part of elaborate pretend play that's pretty common. Also, the children who have imaginary friends, they actually are less shy than other children. They love to tell you about it. They love to tell you about their imaginary friend. They do want to make sure you know it's imaginary, though. One of the things we were wondering about is, do children think that their imaginary friends are real? Do they lose track of the fantasy-reality distinction? And we've learned that no, that is not the case. So in fact, when we talk to children, we interviewed them, we're writing down what they're saying about their pretend friend, many children at some point want to clarify, and they say, it's just a little pretend girl. I made her up. You know that. They just want to make sure we're on the same page. Children understand that their pretend friends are pretend, but they love them anyway. They can be very emotionally caught up in their pretend friends, just the way as adults we get caught up in a movie or a book or other sources of, fictional sources. We know it's not real, but we're emotionally moved anyway. And children love their imaginary friends. So we've learned a lot about what the children are like. They are, like I said, less shy. In some studies, they show some advantage in their verbal ability, but not all. Little girls tend to do this more often in the early preschool years, but by 7, it's about equal between boys and girls. These children tend to be better at social understanding, so when they're thinking about real people and taking the perspective, what that other person thinks or feels, they tend to be a little better at doing that. And lately we've been finding that in laboratory tests of creativity, these children have an advantage. So if we start a story, we say, here, these 2 children are walking through the woods and they find a key. Okay, now it's your turn. What happens next? Children who have imaginary friends tend to come up with endings to that story that are rated as more creative by adults who look at the stories later not knowing which children had imaginary friends and which did not. There are other tests of creativity as well that they do better on than other children. So we've been really fascinated by this. We're also fascinated by what they come up with. Children come up with all kinds of imaginary friends. You might think that they would just invent something that was like themselves, somebody to play with, another boy or girl, and sometimes that is the case. But an imaginary friend can be almost anything. It can be a little fly who sits on your shoulder. It can be a brightly colored bird that sits outside your bedroom window in the tree and makes a lot of noise. It can be a cyclops, a Martian, a panther, you name it. It can be just about anything. And we've been so impressed by what children come up with. It's just what they invent. So they'll tell you about Elfie Welfie, a little tiny tie-dyed person who's married to Sammy Whammy. And Elfie Welfie, everything about Elfie Welfie is tie-dyed. Her hair, her clothes, her sheets, her furniture. And she has a bossy personality. We found that not all imaginary friends are compliant and nice. Lots of them are pretty badly behaved. And children can complain about their imaginary friend. She puts yogurt in my hair. She does this, she does that. We found that when we look at, we've been interested in that illusion of independent agency where the imaginary friend seems to have his or her own personality that even is something the child doesn't want. But we found the same thing when we've interviewed adult fiction writers about the characters in their novels who sometimes have ideas about where that novel should be going. So we continue to look at children's imaginary friends. We've also become interested in the imaginary worlds or paracosms that older children create. All of it is just a part of the imagination, which is an incredible resource to us throughout our lives.